Good evening and welcome everyone. I hope you're all safe and well. Thank you for joining us this evening. My name is Luke Hatton. I'm the Finance Director of Oxford Climate Society and a third-year engineering undergraduate student at Oxford, looking to specialise in low-carbon technologies. Oxford Climate Society is a part of Oxford University, aiming to develop the next generation of informed climate leaders. In addition to our speaker events, we run educational programmes throughout the year, including our award-winning School of Climate Change, which is now teaching over 1,500 people from all across the world in this term's online school. We also run the world's largest student climate journal, Anthroposphere, and we are currently working with the university to develop net zero policies and to incorporate climate into the Oxford curriculums. The theme of today's event is India's energy transition at a crossroads. Often overlooked when discussing international climate politics in favour of its slightly larger neighbour to the northeast, India is currently running one of the largest and most ambitious renewable energy capacity programmes in the world. It is one of the few countries on track to meet its Paris targets, with room to publish even more ambitious targets in the run-up to COP26. However, achieving these targets requires more than just technological transformations, with climate action having to contend with the nation's carbon-intensive development strategies, as well as the country's strong dependence on coal for electricity and heavy industry. While no new coal power stations have been built in 2020, the government is encouraging more coal mining and increased coal production, neither of which are consistent with the Paris Agreement. India's ability to ensure affordable, clean, and reliable energy for its growing population will be vital for the future development of its economy. While expanding solar and wind is transforming the electricity sector, the transport and industrial sectors are proving far more challenging to develop in a sustainable manner. More than any other major economy in the world, India's energy future depends on buildings, factories, and vehicles that are not yet built or bought. This represents a huge opening for policies to steer India onto a more secure and sustainable course. And we look forward to discussing the difficulties involved in making that transition this evening. To provide insight into this topic, we are delighted to be joined by an expert in this area, Professor Navros Dubhash. Unfortunately, due to a last-minute schedule change, Mr. Amitabh Khan is unable to join us, but he has pre-recorded his address, which we will be sharing shortly. Navros K. Dubhash is a professor at the Centre for Policy Research, where he conducts research and writes on climate change, energy, and air pollution. He has been actively engaged in the climate debate as a scholar, policy advisor, and activist for 25 years, and is currently a coordinating lead author for the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Within India, Navros was a member of the group that developed India's low-carbon strategy for inclusive growth and the Committee for a Long-Term Strategy for Low-Carbon Development for India, and he continues to serve on advisory committees for energy, water, and air pollution. Amitabh Khan is the CEO of the National Institute for Transforming India, a government think tank that designs strategic and long-term policy programs for the government. Until May 2016, he was the secretary for the Department of Industrial Policy and Promotion, and he is also a Chevening scholar. We're going to start this event with a speech from each of the speakers with their thoughts on the topic, beginning with Mr. Khan's recorded address. This will be followed by some prepared questions from myself, before opening it up to questions from you, the audience, at the end. If you have any questions for our speakers, please write them in the live stream chat on the right-hand side of YouTube. So thank you very much, Navros, for joining us this evening, and to Mr. Khan for taking the time to record his address. So we'll start with Mr. Khan's recorded address.
Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, I thank Oxford Climate Society for inviting me to speak on India's energy transition. Oxford Climate Society is doing unique work in bringing the awareness towards objective climate actions. As a student society, it pushes multiple stakeholders to debate and produce actionable points for a dire situation as climate change. It is a moment of pride that India is being discussed as a country that has made giant strides towards meeting its climate change goals. I'm glad but not surprised by the recent revelation in the Climate Transparency Report that India is the only country among G20 nations that is on track to meet what it had promised in 2015 during the Paris Agreement on climate change. Unlike the top three emitters, China, the US, and the EU, India's track record of being the only 2-degree compatible country was flagged in a report by a coalition of 14 global think tanks, which showed that the other 19 leading and emerging economies were far, far away from achieving their goals. India is today one of the top 5 renewable power countries in the world by capacity. India's total renewable power installed capacity is 92.5 gigawatts, with 39 gigawatts of wind energy capacity and 39 gigawatts of solar energy capacity as of January 21. India is striving hard to achieve its full commitment of 175 gigawatt of renewable energy, including 100 gigawatt of solar and 60 gigawatt of wind by 2022. Our Prime Minister has also upscaled this target to 450 gigawatt by 2030. In addition, 38 gigawatt of solar and 9 gigawatt of wind is under implementation. We are aspiring for a 30 plus gigawatt addition in every forthcoming year to reach the 450 gigawatt target by 2030. In March 2019, we launched the National Mission for Transformative Mobility and Battery Storage, which is chaired by me. India is already at the cusp of mobility revolution. Global prices of battery have fallen from 1,000 kilowatt hour in last 10 years to less than 100 kilowatt hour for some vehicles. At an overall level, the price hovers around $137 per kilowatt hour. This will give a huge boost to electric mobility in a price-conscious Indian market. India also has the potential to teach the world via unique designs and business models. Global e-commerce companies are piloting Indian three-wheelers for their global operations. It is only a matter of time your grocery delivery being made by India, designed and India-made and completely clean electric three-wheelers. India has formulated forward-looking policies for energy efficiency measures. We are among the top 4 among the G20 countries having a robust energy efficiency policy framework, apart from Japan, Germany, and Italy. The rest of the G20 countries yet do not have extensive energy efficiency policies. India is also among the top countries implementing green finance principles through national green finance strategies. The global reduction in CO2 emission in 2020 has been estimated at 17% over 2019. Apart from the USA and EU and China, India has also contributed a dramatic reduction in CO2 emissions over 2019. Emission in the power sector by almost 8% and the transportation sector by over 16% have considerably reduced the emission. India possesses the massive potential of generating solar with 750 gigawatt and wind with over 300 gigawatt. If these are materialized, India becomes a global leader as a green energy economy and one among the few countries planning for net zero emission country. On a cumulative scale, India may witness an increase in its share of renewables in the overall energy basket in the range of 650 to 831 gigawatt renewable capacity by 2035. This will amount to significant penetration of renewable capacity by about 57 to 64% by 2035 in electricity mix, and this will require grid balancing and integration measures, grid expansion and upgrade systems and operational flexibility, and energy storage. The above estimate made by Niti Aayog is as per the Indian Energy Security Scenario 2047. The above penetration of renewables would lead to falling in the share of coal-fired power generation from 72% in 2020 to about 32 to 43% in 2035. The carbon intensity of power generation correspondingly will fall given the increase in the share of renewables in final energy consumption increases over the next 15 years. The state-run power distribution companies have faced numerous challenges, right from poor revenue collection to steep losses in transmission. As per latest data from the Power Ministry, total outstanding dues of DISCOMs have been there, which have been quite high. And therefore, our challenge is to make these DISCOMs extremely efficient and allow monopolies to be replaced by a hugely competitive distribution system. India also depends on import of components in the entire power sector, both conventional and new energy sectors. And therefore, this is a challenge. From the recent budget, we've heard the challenges within current DISCOM companies. The distribution companies across the country are monopolies. There is a need to provide choices to consumers to promote competition. A framework will therefore be put in place to give consumers alternatives to choose from among more than one distribution company. A revamped, reform-based, result-linked power distribution sector scheme will be launched over the next 5 years. The scheme will assist DISCOMs for infrastructure creation, including prepaid smart metering, feeder separation, upgrading systems, and will be tied up with financial improvements. India recognizes that clean technology manufacturing is a high-tech proposition where global scales and consistent innovations are critical. That is why we've announced a $2.4 billion battery gigafactory scheme and over 600 million solar PV module scheme recently for cutting-edge technologies and global scales. Cutting-edge technologies like curve-less wafer in solar PV, direct wafer, skipping ingots, the Herter junction solar cells, solid-state batteries, and lithium metal batteries have been incentivized heavily in our PLI design. With the rise in solar, more and more energy storage will be required. Many round-the-clock tenders are being issued, and many of these projects will use battery storage to store surplus energy. Our Ministry of New and Renewable Energy has launched the Pradhan Mantri Kisan Urja Suraksha for farmers to install solar pumps and grid-connected solar and other renewable power plants in the country. This is potentially the world's largest productive energy scheme. We have ambitious target for the world's most extensive RE expansion plan with 450 gigawatts of renewables installed capacity by 2030. Further, we've made a target of 20% ethanol blending by 2025, and we are steadily bringing various reforms in the energy sector and making it investor friendly. India has a very liberal FDI policy in the energy sector, including renewables. Up to 100% FDI is allowed under the automatic route for renewable energy generation and distribution projects. We are already rolling out a program for manufacturing advanced chemistry cell via gigafactories and a similar program, as I mentioned, for high efficiency solar cells. Ladies and gentlemen, the recent budget proposes to launch the hydrogen energy mission in 21-22 for generating hydrogen from green power sources. We aim to become a gas-based economy with 15% share in the energy mix by 2030 compared to 6.5% today. An estimated investment of $60 billion is lined up in developing gas infrastructure, including pipelines, city gas distribution, and LNG regasification terminals. India will have a clear path towards decarbonization without any ambiguity as we move forward. This will entail the participation of private and public sectors acting in tandem. There will be a mission focus on indigenous R&D on carbon sequestration, solar, battery storage, and hydrogen, among other technologies, for India to gain leadership in the global energy technologies value chain. The shift towards cleaner fuels through ethanol blending and electric vehicles will catalyze to ensure that we bring down carbon emissions from the transportation sector. India will aim to be a global clean energy leader in deployment, manufacturing, and services. A lot of significant challenges remain, but we are confident that we'll solve these issues. Our focus will be on innovative cutting-edge technologies and power, automotive and industrial fuels, energy efficiency, which will bring a behavioral change among consumers, and Indian consumers already prefer green products. With these few words, I conclude, ladies and gentlemen. These are challenging times, but we look forward to building up a clean energy future.
So I'd like to thank Mr. Kant for taking the time to record his speech. That was a great overview of the progress India has made and is going to make in its energy transition. I'll swiftly pass the floor over to Navrosh Dubash. Thank you for joining us this evening.
Thank you very much, Luke, and my thanks to the Oxford Climate Society. Just going to take a second to share some slides, if I might. See if this works. Yes, so we can you see the slides okay?
Yeah, it seems to be working for me.
Okay, great. So as I said, thank you to Luke and to the organizers at Oxford Climate Society. Mr. Amitabh Kant has given you a very nice overview of what India has done in the recent past, what we aspire to do. I thought I might, in my few minutes, step back a little bit and contextualize some of the challenges that India will face, in a sense, complicate the picture a little bit, because it is a complicated picture, and hopefully that will then allow us to get into discussion with the appropriate, with an appropriately rounded sense of the challenges that we face. So I'm going to try and take you through three broad points. The first is simply to point out that India has a very steep hill to climb in energy terms, because it has a steep hill to climb in development terms. You know, India, just to contextualize India in the global context, in the global scene. The second point I want to convince you of, where I'd spend most of my time, is that while we talk about a energy transition, it's actually multiple linked transitions that we have to think about. And because these are multiple, it becomes so much more complicated. And then I thought I would conclude with a few reflections coming back to what all this means for climate policy and politics in India, because you are, after all, the Oxford Climate Society, and it would be nice to make the explicit bridge back to those issues. So to begin with, this is a kind of graph many of you may have seen before. I'm going to rattle through some of these graphs to paint the big pictures. I won't get into sort of the nuances of it. But this is a picture that shows Human Development Index, countries mapped in terms of their performance on the Human Development Index versus energy consumption. And it's a very well-known correlation. Basically, at lower levels of per capita energy consumption, your Human Development Index tends to be very low. It rises a bit as energy goes up, and then it actually flattens out once you get beyond a certain level, around 0.8 or so in the HDI. And energy use beyond that on a per capita basis doesn't do much for human development. But it does seem that to move up that curve, you do need to have a fair bit more energy. And now there's an interesting academic discussion around this. There's a new discussion around the theme of decent living standards and to what extent energy and human development are in fact in lockstep. And of course, we are in a world where energy and carbon need not necessarily be in lockstep. But this sort of framing has long shaped the conversation in India and driven an understanding that if India is to develop in terms of social development as well as economic development, we will need more energy. Now, how much more energy we can debate, but as you can see, India is fairly low still in that human development scale. So coming out from this, if you look at India's energy capacity growth, it is, as you would expect, rapidly growing. And the bits that you need to focus on are the top stripe there, which is of course coal. And this is now electricity data, I should say electricity rather than energy there. And you can see that coal is the biggest piece of this, and it is growing. But also you see the green stripe down the bottom, which is renewables, which has started growing quite rapidly. And so the question then becomes, and this comes back to what Mr. Amitabh Kant has said, that it's likely, therefore, that Indian emissions coming out of that growing coal use, coming out of increasing demand, will rise. So the part of the graph on the left shows the historical data. This is the very recently launched India Energy Outlook study from the IEA. And there they have three scenarios, right, of how much Indian emissions will rise in the future. The top red line is what they call essentially their current policies scenario. The yellow is what they call their vision scenario, and the blue is the sustainable development scenario. So sustainable development basically involves very substantial efforts to break with the trends from the past. The point I'm trying to make here is that at the moment, all three of these options are in a sense on the table. And there's a lot of discussion about what pursuing the sustainable development or the lowest trajectory option actually means for Indian development. Right? That's kind of an open question, and it's a hard question to answer from a modeling perspective. Let me just pause here to explain why I think that is. If you look at, so in a country like India, where you are growing, and we have historically in the last decade or so grown at 6 to 7% a year, obviously slower in post-COVID times. We are, when you're growing at that rate, you're replacing an awful lot of your capital stock. You're also and so what sorts of technologies are used for things like infrastructure, what sort of technologies are used in buildings and so on and so forth. And as Luke said in his introduction, it offers an opportunity to avoid an awful lot of emissions in the future because we haven't locked into infrastructure. At the same time, given the current state of infrastructure in the next few years, a fair amount of it is going to be steel, cement, and so on and so forth. We don't actually have great ways of meeting those needs in low carbon, using low carbon technologies just yet. So there is some unavoidable amount. But even more than that, we have various transitions we're going through. We're going through an urbanization transition. We're going from 30% to 50% odd urbanized expected. We're going through a demographic transition. We are estimated that we have to develop about 10 million new jobs a year just to keep up with demography, right? So when you have all of these moving parts, all of these things varying simultaneously, and layered on top of that, of course, is assumptions about the rate of technological change. It's very hard to draw these scenarios. And I've done a couple of intermodal studies, and you find that even 15 years out, modeling studies vary by almost an order of magnitude. So this is a hard question to answer. And I want to get that point across. Now, the IEA asked the question, is India on the cusp of a solar revolution? And their projections basically say, all right, you know, we do have a lot of coal. You can see it's 68% in 2020 of the total mix. But we anticipate, as Mr. Kant also said, that renewable energy will rise steeply. Other sources, notably hydro, will remain more or less the same. And the IEA projects a crossing of the two sometime in 2040 in capacity terms, right? So this is something that is underway. It's something that people feel is more or less on track. There are a few questions as to, for example, how much of this depends on the cost of storage technology coming down, and also on a set of things that I'll get to in just a second. But in terms of in terms of renewable energy eating into the coal share, people are quite confident that this will happen in India. So we have a renewable energy transition. What else is going on? What are the multiple transitions I referred to at the beginning of this talk? So I want to take you through a few of those that muddy the waters quite a bit. The second transition, very closely related, is the transition in India's electricity sector. What do I mean by this? Now, this is a slightly old graph. What it shows is in a number of Indian states, what the commercial and industrial grid tariff was at the time. And then the lines going across are different estimates of the cost of renewable energy, notably solar. That line has moved down to below 4 in the last couple of years. And basically what it shows is that it is already cost effective for commercial and industrial users in many Indian states, particularly the most industrialized, to shift to renewable energy, right? Now, of course, there's a question of intermittency. And so what you really want to see is if the cost, including storage, moves down below those tariffs. And according to some estimates and some bids, it already has done that as well. Now, why is this potentially revolutionary, particularly in India? And the reason has to do with the history of India's power sector. And I'll have to pause here again to explain this a little bit. We have a very strange lock-in in India to a power sector and a distribution sector where industry and commercial users pay more than the average cost, and they cross-subsidize households and agriculturalists who pay less than average costs. So for the books to balance, large users, industry and commercial users have to cross-subsidize. Now, if these large users all get off the grid and essentially migrate to their own solar units, then that cross-subsidy also disappears. When the cross-subsidy also disappears, so does the financial health of the sector. And poor farmers, smaller households, et cetera, either get no electricity or the state pays for it through taxpayer money, right? So there's a lock-in, so there's a strong incentive for the Indian state to not let that happen, right? For the reasons of stability. So there is a model that we have grown into that actually works against the rapid adoption of solar. And at some point, there will have to be a reckoning around all of this. So, so in order to maintain the financial health and thereby the social stability of the power sector, we put various checks on this kind of migration, right? So technology is a driver, but politics and institutions are also very much part of the story. So this is something that India has to untangle if you're going to make this transition happen. The second transition is coal dependence, and this is a story that's familiar in Europe. You see it in Poland, which is why Poland is often there are often sort of issues within the EU, in the EU politics around the role of Poland. There are regions in Germany, of course, that are dependent on coal. You could pay to your coal miners a couple of decades ago in a fairly swift and somewhat brutal way, if I might say so, in the 80s. But of course, many countries have this issue. And if we are going to have a just transition, and this is a phrase many of you will have heard, as I, and I'm sure most of you would like, I mean, nobody wants to see these transitions happen in ways that impose social costs. We have to figure out a way to deal with coal mining regions. Now, that picture is actually very vivid. Coal is an incredibly low-tech industry in India. There's an awful lot of hand mining of coal. There's an awful lot of stealing of coal and transporting on cycles, just like this picture shows. It's a miserable livelihood. But at the same time, some 15 million people depend on coal for their livelihoods, directly or indirectly. There's another interesting linkage. 44% of our railways revenue comes from coal. And railways is an incredibly politically important sector in a country that depends very heavily on migrant labor. So if railway ticket prices go up, it leads to social disruption. So to give you a sense, we have an annual budget statement by our finance minister. Well, there is a separate budget statement for the railways. It's that important in the political economy. And then revenues, and I'll come back to this, from coal alone accounts for 3% or so of India's national gross tax revenue. So we have to unpack, we have to figure out what this transition means in terms of social disruptions. One more slide to illustrate this. The map on the left shows the coal-bearing areas marked in gray. The map on the right shows the most promising areas for renewable energy deployment. No prizes for seeing that this involves major geographic imbalance in terms of the economics of energy within India. It would shift the whole, shift westwards where the economics of energy lie in the country, okay? So there's an electricity story, there's a coal story. So to tell you a slightly more good news story, there's also a story about how energy demand patterns will change, right? So the graph at the top basically shows the expected shifts in buildings, transport, industry, demand growth. And of course, they all increase, but they all increase at different rates. Now, how we manage that demand increase is really important. A big piece of that is going to be cooling. We have an opportunity to lock in passive cooling in how we build our buildings. according to one number that gets thrown around a lot, the sort of origins of which I have to say are a bit murky and lost in the midst of time now. It's one of these numbers that gets repeated so often, it's sort of taken as gospel. But one number is that 60% of India's building stock in 2030 is yet to be built, right? So we have a huge opportunity in terms of our demand patterns in the building sector. If we do this right, we can have a 25% reduction in demand compared to a BAU scenario. And the graph in the bottom right basically shows that's because there's a lot of fat in the system. India is, although we use very little energy, we use the energy we use quite inefficiently, which is quite typical of a poorer country. And so there's a lot that we could potentially do there. And one of the things that I think Mr. Kant may have mentioned, but that really is worth noting, is India's energy efficiency program, which I think is actually even more than solar, perhaps, is a success story. One more transition, well, two more, and then I'll switch gears. Public finances. So energy is so strongly interwoven with the public finance system. So overall, 18% of total tax revenues are tied to the energy system, and that is particularly true in the central government, where coal is very important. And it's also true in the state governments where oil and gas is more important. So if we manage to decarbonize, we also have to find substitutes for the revenue that fossil fuels bring for all kinds of other purposes. And the last point here is, and this is related to this, is the banking sector, right? So because we've had this kind of very large state-owned banking sector, and the state has been a large part of the electricity sector, we have had this steep increase over the last decade in coal-fired power plants, many of them bankrolled by public banks. Now, as the renewable energy revolution has come online, and because demand has been less than expected, because energy efficiency programs have been more effective than expected, a lot of those coal-fired power plants haven't been running at capacity, right? And so the public sector banks are taking the hit. So if those plants go belly up, the contagion spreads to the banking sector, again with social and economic disruption. So there's a lot of so you pull on one of these strings, and various sort of parts of the sweater really unravel. So this is why this transition is actually extremely complicated, and it's much more than an energy story. And I think that's really important to keep in mind. I think that's true of most countries, of course, but arguably it's perhaps more true of countries where energy is less strongly determined by the market and where there are all kinds of lock-ins that have to do with preserving livelihoods for poorer people. You have much more social policy happening through energy policy. Okay, so I promised to keep to under 20 minutes, so I'm just going to quickly wrap up with a couple of final points. What does this mean for climate policy and politics in India? And I'm happy to pick this up in the discussion that follows. I think the key point is that there is a long list of concerns ahead of climate mitigation. Job creation is probably at the top. Energy security is really important. One of the reasons that we are also promoting coal, as Luke mentioned in his comments, has to do with trying to substitute for coal imports. Air pollution is an emergent issue that is finally, not a moment too soon really, achieving some political heft. The financial stability associated with the banking sector and so on, as I talked about. So that's in a sense the bad news, right? Mitigation would not make it to the top 10 list of voting issues in India today, and my guess is not for a while longer. The good news side of that story is that India, and many of you who've been following climate politics will know that India has kind of a track record of talking about North-South equity issues in climate change. They continue to be politically important. But more recently, an understanding and a recognition that there are substantial co-benefits of climate and development has led to this kind of flowering of seeking opportunities for low carbon policies, the kinds of things that Kant was talking about, battery storage, electric vehicles, certainly solar and so on. And you can see this little stock cartoon of mine on the side where, you know, somebody in the audience, somebody like myself is giving a talk about all these wonderful things that come along with climate mitigation. And someone says, what if it's all a big hoax and we build a better world for nothing? And that's really the point, right? That in a sense, you don't need to build a case for this. A lot of things that you would want to do anyway will lead to a low carbon future. So looking ahead, just a few wrap-up points to kind of lead into the conversation. So India's energy transition is underway, but I think it's a multi-stranded process, right? We shouldn't kid ourselves that this is simple, even though it's well begun. Mitigation first formulations like net zero, and I heard some reference to that in the opening remarks, like net zero pledges are a tough sell. Your minister, who's the president of elective COP, was in town just the last couple of days, and this was the subject of conversation. So in my view, mitigation first formulations like net zero are not only a tough sell, they may even be unhelpful in the Indian context. And I'm happy to discuss why I think that is the case. And what does seem to be working at the moment is climate opportunism through the pursuit of these development co-benefits. But that sort of approach does lack a broader all of economy transition strategy, and at some point it will be constrained. So thanks very much. I'm going to end, I'm so sorry to say, with a bit of a commercial. We edited a book called India in a Warming World, which actually brings together a lot of voices who've been active in this debate. So if you are interested in reading more, the nice thing is that this is an open access book. You can just scan that little QR code there, or go to Oxford Scholarship Online and just download the whole book. And I'm also going to make a second advertisement. My group just launched a blog written mostly by my younger colleagues called Environmentality. So do check it out. It's just kind of our writings about air, energy, climate, and these debates in India and the world. Would love to interact with Oxford students on some of the things we've been writing. But I hope you don't mind my sticking in these couple of little ads, Luke, and let me hand it back to you.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Navros. That was a great sort of overview and sort of step back, looking at some of the transitions that are sort of coincident with the energy transition. So we'll have a few questions from myself, which I prepared, and then we'll move swiftly on to the audience questions. I know that we're a bit tight on time, but yeah, so I'd love to just pick up where you left off, essentially, talking about the things that are in conflict with climate action in India, in particular, looking at sort of energy security, looking at to what extent is transitioning to a cleaner economy in conflict with ensuring affordable and reliable energy supply to India.
Well, I think the good news is that with the dramatic decline in renewable energy prices, that concern has substantially, if not entirely, abated, right? For many years, the challenge was, well, look, you are basically loading up higher cost power on the backs of the poorest people in the world. And that's just going to be a drag. Now the story is there's a transition cost, including a sort of technology transition issues like intermittency, as well as the kinds of transition issues I talked about with coal and the railways and the distribution companies and so on. It's still a challenge, but it's less of a challenge. So I think that the concern that we will have to undercut our use of electricity has substantially abated. But I think there's still a sense in which many in India would say, you know, we're a little worried about being guinea pigs for this. And what would make the deal much sweeter is if we can build an economic advantage story around a low carbon manufacturing sector to go with to go with this story, right? So there are now concerns about whether we're going to get dependent on China for panels, for rare earths, and so on, rare earth metals and so on and so forth. So if we can actually develop a manufacturing base, it's a much easier sell. And you heard Mr. Amitabh Kant talk about how that's desirable. I think it's a difficult thing to do. To do that requires a very nimble state. It takes us back to ideas from the 70s and 80s about a developmental state. And it's something I'm actually very interested in. To what extent can we have state-led low-carbon development in countries like India? Or is this going to be entirely sort of private sector-led through global networks led by the people like Mr. Gates, who just came out with a book on the subject and so on. So how does a country take advantage of a possible low carbon future, and the kinds of people who've been writing about that, like Maria Mazzucato at LSE and others? I think those debates are really now at the forefront of thinking about whether this story will fly or not.
That's great, thank you. And sort of touching on that really, with sort of the falling cost of solar power, especially in India, to what extent or how difficult is it going to be to integrate that into the grid to sort of build on those energy storage technologies that Mr. Kant mentioned? Is that likely to be a difficulty on a large scale?
Yeah. So I'm on slightly weak ground on that question. I don't know the numbers and the modeling on that so well. I do know that the kinds of tools required to answer that question are just being built in India among think tanks and researchers to look at how one would deal with intermittency, what sorts of transmission networks you would need to achieve to make sure that the grid is operating at sufficient scale to take advantage of variation in insolation and wind speeds and so on across the country. There are some interesting kind of stories that one can delve into there. So one of the interesting things is that many wealthy Indians, at least upper middle class Indians, because Indian electricity has been of such low quality for so long, right, have got used to having intermittent power, right? We have blackouts. I grew up, and all my entire generation certainly grew up with blackouts. For the last 10 years, we all have these truck batteries in a little box at the entrance to our house, which get charged when the electricity is on, and then the polarity flips and it charges, and it provides 3 lights and 3 fans when it's off. So in a sense,
sorry to quickly interrupt. Can you stop sharing your screen?
Oh yes, absolutely. Yeah.
Sorry. Continue.
No, that's okay. I'm trying to figure out now how to do that because it's. There it is. Yeah. Sorry. So one question is, all right, if Indians are culturally got used to intermittent power, well, why don't we just have clean intermittent power instead of dirty intermittent power? Because we haven't really solved this problem, and we can buffer that anyway with the batteries that many of us have already invested in, right? And then there's also talk. I mean, I've heard people talking about sort of instead of having storage technology at the generation end, having micro storage embedded in appliances. So what would it look like if you had little bulbs and refrigerators and so on, all with their own storage built in, right? Might that be a way to actually manage the question of intermittency? So there's because we haven't got locked into high quality power, ironically, there are actually creative things one could do.
That's great, thank you. So my next question, very topical, is, and I've asked this to most of my speakers, to what extent has COVID disrupted the energy transition? Has it provided, what challenges has it provided, and what opportunities has it also facilitated?
So I think the overwhelming effect of COVID is that we had one of the steepest drops in the economic growth rate of any country, 23% year on year in one quarter. Our fiscal deficit has ballooned. And so there is very little cash lying around to do anything particularly creative, right? That's been a big problem. In terms of our recovery package, you know, the question is, can we kind of build back better, as the slogan goes, through the use of fiscal stimulus and so on? And the money has really gone to provide a safety net to the most vulnerable, as well as to provide a safety net to medium and small scale enterprises that have needed it, and so on. So that whole story about fiscal stimulus, fiscal green stimulus, has really been a non-starter. But we have created, in trying to stimulate jobs, we have designated the renewable energy sector kind of a champion sector to get various advantages. We have created rules that privilege the renewable energy sector to make sure they don't bear the burden of reduced demand. Simultaneously, we have stimulated auctioning of coal mines to try and jumpstart productivity and labor growth in the mining sector, right? Now, that is a mixed track record. I think the saving grace is that many of us think that at least for electricity use, there will be few takers for more coal-fired power plants in India, because right now the economics simply don't line up. Industrial use may be a slightly different story, and I can talk about this subsequently if you like. But I think what most people seem to think is that coal use hasn't peaked in India yet, but coal capacity is very close to peaking. And because our coal plants are running at less than full capacity, they are likely to ramp up, partly because they're not making money. And as I mentioned, if they don't make money, the contagion spills to the banking sector. They will be asked to burn more coal for a few more years. But in a sense, it's a good news story, because we are not going to do what China did, which is massively ramp up our coal fleet. That story is over. So fortunately, renewables came below, the cost of renewables came below the cost of coal, just as India was pressing the accelerator, and we've taken our foot off.
That's great, thank you. And sort of building on that, talking about in heavy industry and fertilizers, do you see, so obviously that's going to be the most difficult and the most costly sectors to decarbonize. Do you see, or what governmental policies and actions would you recommend to sort of jumpstart that or to accelerate it?
Yeah, so that's another area that I don't focus personally on quite that much. But I do think that, so there's certainly conversation about it in India, but I think this is an area that's really ripe for international coordination, international cooperation. This is an area where some pooling of capacity in mines and money to develop techniques that allow productive gains in the hard to abate sectors could really bear some fruit. So I think this is something that, this is probably the most promising direction, because it's the kind of investment, the kind of thing that it's hard for one country to take on by itself.
It's in the benefit for all countries.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great example where a public good could be generated. Yeah.
That's great, thank you. So I think we'll move on to the audience questions now. So we've got, how have the recent Electricity Act amendments addressed the need for renewable off-grid markets and deregulation of discoms, so distribution companies?
I'm sorry, the question was, how have the recent Electricity Act amendments affected the...
So how have they addressed the need for renewable off-grid markets and deregulation of discoms?
Well, there are, excuse me, there are proposed amendments. There's a fair bit of controversy and pushback against them. There is certainly part of the effort, and this is something that we've periodically come back to in India, is the stimulation of competition at the discom level. I personally have very mixed feelings about it, partly because I think if you have that, well, first of all, the track record of retail competition has been very spotty in much of the world. So half the US states have done it, half the US states haven't done it. There is in India a further question of whether or not we will end up with an electricity apartheid structure there, because if you do allow for multiple licensees, they will all go into areas where there are wealthier consumers. And you might have competition in some of those areas. You may not have the mechanism to actually transfer the gains across to areas that will get left behind. And as I said, I mean, it should be obvious by now, my approach to climate policy is very much one that puts at the center social equity and justice. I don't think we're going to politically sustain a climate transition if we leave people behind. So I'm not sure I've seen great answers as to how that can be done by the introduction of retail competition. But it is very much on the anvil. It's a live issue for discussion.
That's great. So the next question, you mentioned political lock-in and public finances. If the government owns a majority stake in Coal India Limited and coal cross-subsidizes railways, what do you see as an incentive of the government to phase out coal?
Yeah, there isn't much, right? So it is one of the ways in which we are locked into the existing system. Now, the way in which we have squared that circle historically in India is we say, look, we are a chronically energy scarce society. Therefore, we can basically go full steam ahead on everything simultaneously, and there'll be space for all of it. Right? That has been the argument in the past. Well, somewhere around 2014, 2015, this flipped. We went hell for leather with new coal-fired power plants. As I said, energy efficiency kicked in, and suddenly we went from an energy deficit country to an energy surplus country. Mind you, an energy surplus country with 300 million consumers in the dark, right? So 300 million people didn't get electricity because it was not cost effective for the distribution companies to provide them electricity. So theoretically, we were surplus. A lot of people needed electricity. What was missing was the institutional structures that gave the DISCOMs the incentive to actually provide that electricity. Right? So it's that kind of tangled context that India is operating in at the moment.
That's great. Thanks. So for the next question, we have many countries are decarbonizing through a shift to gas. Is the IEA's prediction that India will follow this, given the limited domestic production, realistic? It cites import increase from 30 to 120 BCM from 2019 to 2040.
Right. Yeah, so I have limited detailed knowledge of the gas market, but there's definitely a lot of conversation about gas imports and increasing gas imports. And like with other countries, the question is, do you take that bargain where you move from a relatively high carbon fossil fuel to a relatively low carbon fossil fuel and reap some mitigation gains relative to a baseline now? But does that lock out essentially zero carbon sources down the road? So that's a question that continues. But as the questioner noted, it's compounded by the fact that we just don't have a lot of gas, right? But diplomatically, there's lots of conversation with the US about upping imports. As I think Amitabh mentioned, we also have just launched the hydrogen mission. So there's lots of discussion on alternative fuel carriers. But my bet would be that gas will go up. Whether it will go up to the extent that everybody says is unclear. I will just say one more thing about the gas economy. I think one of the success stories actually in India is the relatively successful program to make accessible cooking gas to the poor, which then has huge development benefits, right? Because it displaces wood burning, kerosene burning, and so on and so forth. The kerosene economy is terribly distorting for all kinds of reasons. It kind of spills over into the transport sector. Wood burning has huge effect on the health of children and women in particular. It has effect on in terms of women's economic opportunities through the time spent on collecting firewood. Interestingly, it's probably a bit worse from a climate point of view, right? Because biomass, collected biomass is carbon neutral. Gas is carbon positive. But it's a good example of the sort of development trade-off that India has to make, right? It's a bargain that I would take. I think it's a good example of where if you have to cut a poor country some slack, that's where you would cut some slack, right? Let's get clean fuels into people's houses, even if it adds a tiny bit to the global burden. Yeah.
Great. How will India make sure substandard manufacturing does not dominate the renewable energy market and avoid a waste problem 5 years from now?
Yeah. Yeah, we need the chairman of Renew Power on the panel for that one. I don't have a very good answer. I think there are people who worry that the extreme competition for bids and the rapid decrease in prices that we've seen over the last few years is an indication of over-aggressive bidding, and may well lead to the kinds of phenomenon that the kind of problem that the questioner is raising, right? That we'll end up with fairly low quality hardware. So I think it is something to watch for.
Yeah. Next question. Professor Dubash, what is your view on the recent disaster in the state of Uttarakhand? Yeah. Curious due to its links with electrification and ecology. What is the implication for the expansion of hydropower in India?
Yeah. Again, a very good question. My sense is that, and I'm guessing the questioner has followed this more carefully than I have. My sense is that the Uttarakhand disaster, it's hard to trace it back very directly to a climate impact per se. But in Uttarakhand, the broader patterns of land use have, certainly with the last disaster a few years ago, have definitely been part of exacerbating the effects of such sort of violent water flow events. So I do think it is. I think it's really part and parcel of a larger conversation about natural resource management. In terms of the hydro question, again, I haven't read it carefully enough to say whether this basically tells us that we're playing fast and loose with the geology of Uttarakhand, because the state is dotted with hydro projects of various sizes, run-of-the-river projects, and environmentalists have long been worried about these sort of destabilizing events. So I think it's good that it shines a light on this. I'm not expert enough in this to know whether this is a smoking gun or whether this is the reason why we take drastic action. Yeah. I'm just being cautious here. I just don't know. As a general story, I certainly think there's grounds for concern.
Okay. We've just got a quick follow-up. So where is the official number of the 300 million of consumers unelectrified? They're just asking if you could share the source for academic purposes.
Yeah. Oh, well, so this is okay. So like with cooking gas, right? The question is right to push back on this. This is an old number again that used to get thrown around. Like with cooking gas has now reached many more people than it did before. But we find that surveys suggest that many people actually don't buy a new cylinder when their old cylinder finishes. or they keep using the gas alongside other cooking sources, right? So in an analogous way with electricity, India has made great strides in providing access to electricity in terms of stringing electricity out to households. And so we are electrified in that sense. But the quality of supply, the reliability of supply, and the fact that when discoms face any shortages, it's rural areas that are low paying that are the first to be switched off, means that the effective access to electricity is really low, right? But I think the question is right to push back on me. That 300 billion number is definitely from a few years ago, and it actually it stuck in my head because I'll just say this. There was a massive blackout in North India several years ago now, and the headline in the satirical newspaper The Onion was lights back on in North India, 300 million people in the dark, which kind of captured the state of the sector at the time, and that's always stuck with me. But I was sloppy. I shouldn't have used that number. But the fact of the matter is that a lot of people effectively do not have adequate electricity supply. And part of the argument we've been making is that the next step in electricity access in India is to go from stringing out line, so theoretical access to electricity, to actually creating the conditions where people are willing to pay for electricity because they have access to productive technologies, right? So if you subsidize not the consumption of electricity, but you subsidize productive technologies, then that electricity use enhances your paying capacity. And when it enhances your paying capacity, you can pay a cost recovery tariff, and then the distribution company will be happy to provide you electricity, right? So the way to break out of this cycle is to actually enhance the productive uses of electricity in rural areas. But thank you for that question. It was right to pull me up.
That's great. Thank you. What would you say is the role of courts in India's transition to renewable energy?
So it's a thought-provoking question. Courts definitely have a very big role in environmental politics, frankly, and frankly, a mixed role, where a lot of times they will kind of push through solutions that are problematic. I'll give you an example in air quality, where the court orders large air purifiers in public spaces in the open air. I mean, it's just very ineffective and it's very wasteful. In the electricity sector in the past, the legal battle was often around. Okay, so let me back up a little bit. Many years ago in India, we created these electricity regulators with the idea that they would be independent technocratic bodies, but in fact, they were subject to as much political push and pull as any other part of the sector. And so a lot of their decisions came under judicial review. And I did a study a while ago, I can't remember the numbers, but a very large share of decisions by many regulators would come under judicial review. A separate tribunal was created just for electricity. So because of this, because the role of regulators has remained disputed, the courts end up having a really important role in settling key issues. So one very notable case, for example, was whether or not a power purchase agreement could be reneged upon because Indonesia had changed its own rules, right? So was that a force majeure case that then allowed renegotiation of a power purchase agreement with enormous implications for the cost of electricity to many. So the courts continue to play a substantial role. Another area they play a role in is in renewable energy portfolio standards, which when renewables were more expensive, there was this sort of policy that all states had to have a certain share, work towards a certain share of renewables, right? So you had a curious situation where you were, in a sense, ordering states to increase their share of costly power, at the same time as the regulator's job was to make sure that the distribution companies made the books balance and were on a cost recovery basis. So you were sending very mixed messages to the regulators. So they found all kinds of ways to duck those renewable portfolio standards. Less of a problem now, of course, now that solar is cheaper, but those are the kinds of things that would come to the courts.
That's brilliant, thank you. In electricity, if the long-term power purchasing agreements lock in coal for decades, oh, sorry, let's go on to the next page. How do we navigate this issue? Are short-term bidding markets a better option for renewables to push out coal?
Right. So the electricity market is sort of a complicated piece in India, like in other places, and we have a combination of these long-term power purchase agreements that are kind of legacy of the past, and we also have a wholesale market and a spot market. So certainly not having those lock-ins, not having an electricity institutional architecture that allows for cheaper, low-cost power to find a place definitely helps. But there's a lot of ongoing debate about that market architecture through the Central Electricity Regulatory Commission, and it rapidly gets very technical, and there's lots of debates and discussions about what would work and what wouldn't work. I mean, I think the history of this in the past has been that if you don't allow power purchase agreements, then you don't have the predictable economic relationships with buyers that then allow generators to raise money from capital markets with the assurance of buyers. Now, with renewable energy becoming more important, that dynamic may have switched somewhat. But yeah, it rapidly gets very, very technical and very complicated. But yes, the bottom line is the design of the market is really quite critical in terms of giving renewable energy space to compete with coal.
Of course, that's great. I think this might be our final question. Why is solar adoption so slow? 37 gigawatts of 100 gigawatts 2022 targets. Are subsidies a blockage for markets to develop, or like you said, is this by design?
Well, the part about the design was really there was sand in the wheels thrown that would make it harder for industrial users to leave the grid by introducing what was called a cross-subsidy surcharge, literally saying, if you're not going to provide us a cross-subsidy, you have to pay us a surcharge.
Yeah.
So that was the sand in the wheels back then. I'm not sure the adoption is really that slow. I mean, I don't know what one would benchmark as slow versus fast. Look, back in 2010, 11, the first national solar mission said 20 gigawatts of solar. Then it became 100. Now they're talking about 450 total of renewables. These are all really very rapid, dramatically, almost exponential growth in capacity. And I think among the fastest in the world, certainly slower than China, but I think not much slower than anywhere else. So I'm not sure whether you could really say it's slow. I think one of the main constraints has been the higher cost of capital in India, because obviously capital costs are the biggest. Renewable energy is all capital costs and no operating costs, and so the higher cost of capital has really been a factor, and that's what the renewable energy industry often grumbles about. So there's been lots of discussion about what are the ways in which to kind of lower the cost of capital for renewable entrepreneurs in India.
That's great. Thank you so much. I think with that, I might close up. I want to say many thanks to you, Navros, for joining us this evening and for providing an interesting insight into the challenges and opportunities faced in India's clean energy transition. And thanks again to Mr. Amitabh Kant for providing his pre-recorded speech. To all our audience, I hope that you've enjoyed tonight's event. I've just got 2 other events to flag for Oxford Climate Society in the next week. So on Next Monday evening, we have our flagship event of term. We're welcoming Noam Chomsky to talk about neoliberalism, democracy, and the climate crisis. So that's beginning at 8 o'clock in the evening, and it'll be streamed as this one was onto our YouTube. More details can be found on our Facebook. And on Friday, Oxford Climate Society are pleased to be collaborating with the ISIS magazine, and we're presenting our first multilingual event, and this is focusing on extraction education. This event is quite unique in that all of our panelists are exclusively from Indigenous backgrounds and are able to share their individual experiences on this issue. Language range from English to Spanish to Hindi, with our speakers including Katie Machao, Sonny Suri, and Ruby Hebron. And this is on Friday, the 19th of February at 5 p.m. GMT. Yeah, so both those events will be streamed on YouTube, much like this event, and see our Facebook and Eventbrite pages for more details on them. And please make sure to sign up to our newsletter to keep up with all our other activities. With that, I'll bring our event to a close. I hope you have all enjoyed and have a nice rest of the evening.